I fear this video is going to be a little bit more longer and drawn out because it's a complicated issue to talk about. I was talking with someone about homeschooling, and they were talking about how a friend of theirs, who happens to be a reporter, but really not a liberal one, not a conservative one either, just sort of in between. In other words, what reporters are actually supposed to bloody well do. And he had two boys. He homeschooled his boys, and he always took his boys with him wherever he went. It was always a learning opportunity. There was always something nearby he could expose them to broaden their education. Sounds like a beautiful thing. Boys have been to Europe, boys have been all over. And when this gentleman met these boys, I believe both were in their early teens, he said they were like miniature adults. They were very well spoken, very well behaved, just all around great future citizens. And a discussion came up on whether homeschooling is good or bad. You know, the typical argument from the left is it limits your socializing. You end up starting children off with a handicap when it comes to socializing with people of their own age. And it almost sounded true when you thought about how these two teens were described as miniature adults. So, does it really affect children in a negative way? Well, a couple other people got involved, and the discussion grew. It ended up going on to the local radio station. Other people chimed in, with some were homeschooled, some weren't. And I made an interesting connection when you broaden it. In the 1800s, when we were a rural society, if there was a school locally, it was a one-room schoolhouse. And, of course, it was the neighborhood that got together, built the schoolhouse, and hired a teacher. But even then, even with that limited socializing, still the most important thing was to eat. It was your chores at home. You would go to school, go back home, do all your chores, help your boys would help their father in the field, help him care for the large animals. Daughters would help mother around the home, would help with the smaller animals, cooking, cleaning, etc., etc. Yes, it was very sexist back then. Deal with it, feminist. Yet, all of these children were very well suited to become adults as soon as they got married, which honestly happened early, anywhere from 14 to 18. They were already married, already starting a family, and already carrying on. Yet, you look at society today, and you have to ask, what happened? You know, we have this concept of teenage rebellion, which you really do not find that much written about prior to the 20th century. The concept of teenage rebellion prior to the 20th century is basically a completely foreign concept. One has to ask, why did this happen, and why does it seem to be becoming so much more extreme as time passes? You could use the drug argument, not that the teens are using drugs, though that is obvious in many circumstances. No, the drug argument is that when things become normal, you need you build up a resistance, and you need more of an effect to get the same sort of rush. So today's rebels need to go much further than their parents did, because if they don't, well, they're not really rebellion, they're just following in their parents' footsteps. And thus, every generation, it seems like every generation just becomes worse than every previous generation, to sound like a curmudgeon. I don't believe that's the case, though. I don't believe it's that every generation is becoming worse, and I don't even believe liberals like Lewis Black's argument that it's not that the children are rebelling, it's not that the children are getting worse, it's that the fact that grown-ups just have never known a damn thing and they forgot what it was like to be a child. What I actually believe is, if you look at since the 1950s, when the U.S. was more of an urban society than a rural society, the amount of interaction between parent and child decreased. The most important person in a child's life was no longer their parent. It became their social life. It became themselves. It became their peers. It became their girlfriend, their boyfriend. So before they reached a level of maturity, they were already basically on their own, even though they were under their parents' house and their parents' rules. Also, you can look at how in the 1930s the extended family broke down, and this was encouraged by FDR and Social Security, because there was always the extended family. There would be three generations, sometimes four generations, under the same roof. Grandparents, parents, children, and if the children were old enough, great-grandchildren. All under the same roof. So there was always some sort of direct family involvement in the child's life. Well, this slowly started dissipating in the 1950s. More broken homes started existing in the 1950s, but it was still a situation where the one parent was able to work and the other one stayed home and raised a child. But the extended family was breaking down, had basically broken down. Then in the 1960s, it became a little bit more extreme. In the 70s, divorce became more commonplace. In the 80s, it was no longer taboo to be a single parent. Of course, in the 60s, also the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which did a lot to destroy the family of the poorest Americans, because many of the rules prevented an extended family, prevented the traditional family, from existing, because if you had both parents, you could, under the same roof, you could not get governmental aid. You could not get welfare. And now we look at the 80s and the 90s. Both parents are working. Children have next to no supervision. They go to school, then they go home. And that has continued to this day. When children no longer see their parents as the most important individual in their life, and they start looking to others, they start becoming influenced much more, to a much greater degree, by their peers than their parents. There's that desire always, it's human nature, to one-up each other. So to prove that they're more adult, more grown up, they have to go further. They have to be more extreme than their peers, so their peers will look up to them. And I believe that this is the problem. Now, I'm not saying that there's an easy fix for it, but if you look at homeschooled children, their still in a situation where the most important person in their lives is their parent. It's not their peers, it's not their teacher, it's their parents. And they tend to be more mature for their age, despite any potential problems that may develop from lack of socializing, which many of those problems are overrated, and it's actually difficult to blame all of them just on homeschooling, because there's plenty of awkward children that have never been homeschooled. But just something to think about. Are we just letting our children run wild and then wondering what the hell is happening? It doesn't help the fact that the government is getting more and more involved in the raising of our children, and the government is telling us more and more of what we can do to discipline them, what we can't do, holding us responsible but tying our hands behind our back. The logic is, it completely misses. Psychologists believe that they know exactly the best way to raise every possible child, how to deal with every child. And yet, I wonder how their children turn out, since they're so buried in their careers developing these theses. And even if they are 100% correct, and they have the most amazing children, the most well-behaved, the most highly accomplished children of the rest, all of the rest of us. Not everyone is a psychologist or a psychiatrist. We cannot successfully apply their techniques. And yet, the government prevents us from doing what has worked for thousands of years, what has developed in step with human nature. And I just have to wonder if all of this experimenting with the family, this concept of improving human nature, is actually causing the deterioration of all of us in the West. And if you look at other cultures, the more important, the more strongly the connection is to the family, either just mother and father or the extended family, the less problems there are with the youth. And even when there are problems with the youth, there is still that level of respect that you don't cross your mother, you don't cross your father. You may be running wild on the streets, but you still give a certain amount of respect to your parents. It's an idea that maybe we should consider, maybe we should play with. Maybe we don't need all the stuff, and we can get by with only one income. But each of us has to make that decision on our own. It's just something to think about. I hope I didn't bore you too much with this super long extended video. Just a little social engineering discussion. Much love, and keep the faith, people.